So this is, what's the name of our session? Our session is B, I know the name of it, I was getting the number, B01, Podcast Production Studios. Welcome. I guess this is the first session. This is the first session from the broadcasting track. So unlike in years past where Dave or somebody gets to announce the upcoming sessions and does some advertising propaganda, they've asked me to do it. So there are two more sessions today in the broadcasting track, Innovations in Audio Processing. That's at 1:30, and the immersive audio experience creation for sports venues. That should be a really interesting one. A little bit later in the day at 3:45. Okay, and today we're going to talk about a pretty hot subject, podcasting. You can't really open a newspaper or Shelley Palmer's rag or anything else without seeing something about podcasting. Some big money being spent on it. And everybody's very interested in it, and everybody's not completely sure what it is. Everybody's got their own idea. It's a little bit of the Wild West. It's kind of interesting. We're going to drill in on the facilities part of it and a little bit of the technology. This is not a business class. We'll let Harvard do that or anybody else that wants to tackle that. I'm John Storyk, founder of Walter Storyk Design Group, and designing studios and technology spaces for 50 years, and I'm just going to try to be the ringmaster of this and let some friends of mine do the work. Okay? We're going to be in this discussion using two facilities as specific examples. These are very serious podcasting facilities that are owned and run by some pretty big companies. I'm going to let the chief engineers of each of those companies tell you who they are, if you don't already recognize their names. So we have the two engineers we have chief engineer from Stitcher, John DeLore, over there, and we have a similar chief engineer, production engineering from Gimlet, Austin Thompson. Gimlet is, of course, now owned by Spotify. Everybody knows that. So these are very serious companies that have recently built very interesting facilities that have similarities and differences. Maybe they'll share that with us. Full disclosure, both of these facilities were designed by our company. That just means I had their phone numbers and I could get them to come here for no money this early in the morning. So we get that out of the way. And the project manager on both of those facilities was my partner and really good friend, Romina, Larregina, right here. She's an architect and acoustic engineer from our company. And a very dear friend, 45 years in our industry, a systems engineer and systems designer, Judy Brown, who worked on one of them and in part on another one of these, and has got hundreds of studios under her belt, going back quite a ways. Each person will talk about different aspects of podcasting planning and design. What I suggested for a structure is that we're going to do it by each facility. Romina can kind of take you through the thinking about how they were laid out, some of the acoustic issues, general plan, and then while we're on that facility, we're going to start with Stitcher first. I simply took the coin, and that one came up first. One's in Manhattan, one's in Brooklyn. And then we'll stay on that facility, let that facility's chief engineer tackle some of the workflow issues, how they produce podcasts, and then we'll do the same thing for Gimlet. Judy has some engineering issues that might be interesting to discuss, and then we're going to leave a lot of time for questions. It's not that easy to get this group up on the same stage. I don't know if you know each other that long, right? No. Right, they've been doing the same thing for, I guess, competitors. I imagine you could say that, but there's a lot of space in the podcasting world right now. So I think the word competitor is a very strange word in podcasting. And I kind of I feel really blessed, actually, that I'm responsible for you meeting each other. We do the same thing. It's interesting, people doing the same thing for large podcasting companies and don't even have time to have a cup of coffee with each other, let alone explore each other's facilities. So that's a real blessing. Romy on the other, Romina's nickname is Romy. So has spent a lot of time with both of these people. They either love her or hate her. They love her. Yeah. At least they still talk to each other. Okay, so we're going to get started. That is Romina's daughter. We looked for a long time to get a little photo about how we would start this. And I don't know, maybe that's the future of podcasting. Who knows where this is all going to go. If that's the future of podcasting, you guys wasted a lot of money. But or not. Okay, and that's Zoe, who is...
Well, actually helped me on that day to do the punch list.
Actually, Romy has helped us do the punch list. Yes, that's correct. So, Romina's going to start. Thank you. This is a pretty big group, but it's still not so big that if somebody has a question in the middle of the presentation, usually there's, do the presentation and then everybody stands up for questions. But if you think of this as a class, we're about 50 people here, it's still pretty manageable. I prefer, if you have a question, you just raise your hand. We'll stop, just jump over to the mic because they record this.
Go to the mic.
Okay? And let's ask it. We don't have to wait till the end. It's not that formal. Think of this as a conversation. Okay? We did a little bit of planning and there's a few slides that kind of help us, but think of it as a giant conversation. So the questions are going to make this better. So if you have one in the middle, just stop us. It's okay. It's not that official. All right? Let's get going. Oh yeah, I got it. Here we go.
All right, so we'll start with Stitcher Studios. John and I worked very closely together on programming. This facility sits in Five Variety Park. It's an amazing place, very close to Central Park, so the location is wonderful. The facility, if you want to go to the next slide, there were some challenges with the layout. You will see some photos later on. John calls us up and says, well, I want to put all these studios together, one next to each other, and I have about 2,000 square foot space. Okay, so with that we started to lay out the program, see exactly what they needed and how we could fit everything in, not only layout-wise, but also understanding that there's isolations between the studios. Each room that you see there could become a podcast studio easily, although they're labeled as control rooms. Those rooms also function as podcasts. Okay, John, you can anytime.
Yeah, so again, one of the big challenges with this space is it's a midtown office building, and you can see the full footprint down there. And when we location scouted, I was trying to get a little bit bigger of a footprint, but that's what we ended up getting. That's what they said they could spare. So what we're trying to do is fit a lot of function into a small amount of space. And as Romina was saying, it was important for us that the control rooms could function as studios if we hit, and this is, right now, we're even with these studios, we're like probably half capacity. We still have lots of time on the calendar, but it keeps inching up every month, busier and busier. So we wanted to be sort of future-proof, so if we were in a situation where we needed to use a control room to do an interview and a live room for an interview, we have two recording systems that we can split out. So that was important. So anyway, yeah, what you're looking at is Studio A up here, which we wanted for recording bands. We want to get into the music space, live music performance, but also recording custom scores for different podcasts. So we wanted a room to do that. I got one ISO booth. They made me have a green room. I wanted that to be like the drum room. But again, limitations of space. But all these rooms are all interconnected, so there's a lot of additional functionality built into all these, which is really good.
There's also a lot of viewing between the rooms as well. There's windows, so there can be interaction between if they in fact have a podcast going on in one of the studios and in the control room if they're mixing it. So the challenges of this, and maybe we can go to the next slide. The challenges of this space where program was one. We went back and forward a lot on how big the space would be, how many people it would fit, the right layouts, etc. The building was a challenge. The heights were extremely low. Bottom of beam was 9'9". And all of these rooms are fully isolated, meaning floating floor and acoustic lid. So everything is up, and they were very. We had a challenge with the heights. We made it work, but it was pretty challenging in regards to this building. Another thing that we found with John that was a challenge was they're renting this space, and there's leases on all the rentals. And the lease agreements should always be read when if you want to explore something that you want to do in the facility that you're renting, just to make sure that you read what kind of limits you have, not only on noise level, but also on HVAC, like the units that you need to use. HVAC won't run 24/7, but the studios do need it to be 24/7 and things like that, power consumption, etc. So that was also something that I think was very interesting in this project, same as Gimlet, where the lease was important and actually drove some part of the design based on what kind of lease agreements they had.
Talk about the MC levels for these rooms.
Yeah.
Let's go back.
The control rooms, as you see them, they're NC 20. But normally the control rooms are NC 20, but in all these rooms, they would have an open mic. So we said, well, we can't stay with our standards of control rooms and NC 20, so every single room is actually NC 15, very, very quiet spaces. You can't hear the air conditioning through the grills or lights or humming or anything like that. They're extremely quiet. Also, we are bordering a very, there's a lot of traffic. Luckily, we were able to work out the layout, so we had that perimeter corridor, which helped us with the separation between the exterior and the studios, because as you see, we only have one door. And the STC levels of all these rooms are very good. Our concern wasn't too much with transmission to the lower level, which was a lobby, and the NC levels we were getting where we went to take measurements were NC 45. So the ambient noise already in the lobby was very high. We would never bother them, but we were concerned about the third floor tenants, which we didn't have any control of. So that's why we made every room floated, because then it would give the possibility to Stitcher to record whenever they wanted. Didn't matter what the neighbors were doing. So these are a couple of photos to trace more or less through the construction. First, we did that with almost every project. We go measure, take existing conditions for acoustic measurements, see how the building behaves, how much noise comes through those windows, how much transfer we have between slabs, between adjacent floors. So that's the very first step. Then we do schematics, drawings, etc. And then the second photo is already in construction, where all the rooms are being laid out, and we go and check every single wall and coordinate with the builder to see if there are any issues. And then there's just some other pictures throughout the construction of Stitcher that just shows the third one on the top, the complexity of this job, trying to get around all those beams and very low ceiling heights. It was extremely challenging, so much so that we would just draw what needed to happen in each room for HVAC, for the soffits, for the conduit to the almost half an inch. So it was challenging, to say the least. Luckily, we had a good superintendent.
Yeah, it was great. I was deputized as the neoprene, the rolls of neoprene. All of the AC and all the ductwork that was sort of in the ceiling and routed around. You know, we're building the sound isolation, like the walls and the ceilings right up against this. So I remember some of the early punch lists, you guys would come and be like, let's wrap that. And that became sort of my daily job as I walk by the contractors with the roll neoprene, like wrap that. Just trying to kill every vibration.
I remember our super, I was on site one day just kind of walking around, and I remember hearing him yell across the floor, somebody get some more neoprene.
Yeah. But it's again, like when we location scouted this, I think the engineering feat that they pulled off, I had never been involved in a studio build like this. And so when you walk into a space and you look at the ceiling, you're like, oh, this is plenty of space. But once you lift the floor and you lift the ceiling, you start to lose, I don't know what we lose in that process. But suddenly they were really coming up with these
12 feet easy.
Yeah.
12 inches easy.
Yeah, so you're losing a foot just like that, and then there's clouds and whatnot. So they really did a marvelous job of figuring out how to reroute HVAC, and like that's just like a part of the job I hadn't even seen coming. But
I should add, this is not a good site. I mean, this was done, and you're watching it, but podcasting rooms are small. I mean, even a big podcasting room is a small room compared to other kinds of rooms that we're used to dealing with. As you've already seen, and as you'll see again in the Gimlet. Think about it. They're rooms that are dealing with 2, 4, 6 people, mostly talking, even if it's just some music. They're small rooms. So everybody could easily get tricked into thinking that we don't really have to pay attention to column spacing, which is probably true, and that we can kind of put these rooms anywhere. But the point that was just discussed is just the beginning of the problem. 12 inches is minimum if you want to get isolation. And of course, there's never enough room. 12 inches is if you know what you're doing. 16 and 18 inches often, and that does not take into consideration air conditioning. Air conditioning, pipes, acoustic treatments, which John just referred to as clouds. So you can, conduits, etc. So you can walk into a site and it sort of looks pretty good, maybe 10 feet, looks higher than normal, and that's not really high enough. This was bordering on an unacceptable site.
I
But
had no idea that we were presenting them with an
right,
unacceptable
and it was
site.
selected. Right. But it was selected for, I think, other kinds of reasons.
Location.
Geographic reasons, business reasons, location. It's in an amazing location, etc. So to get both of those are tough. Gimlet's a little better on height. Not much. Still, as you'll see, very similar problem. So you can't have too much height. Can't be too thin in rock and roll. Can't have too much height in studio construction.
Part of that too, like the location selection, is the fact that like we're not just studios. If you're a recording studio and that's what all your space is going to be for, you're obviously looking for different space.
Yeah.
But we're businesses too, so it's like you're really looking to shoehorn professionally built studio with great sound isolation. You do what is essentially a commercial
Yeah,
office.
the rest is offices and conference rooms and kind of spaces, as you can see on the lower level.
Yeah, this is just a small part.
Our area was only 10%.
By the way, this is another little trick that we've done more than once, okay, which is to sort of get rid of the outside wall by making it circulation. If there's a need for daylight in the studios, that's a whole other conversation, which, by the way, we could get into. Some people think it's a liability. Some people think it's not. That's the case. I don't even know if that's a conversation, it's just an issue. But it would not be hard to get daylight into these rooms by just having windows on the rooms. But putting the corridor next to the outside wall actually looks like it might waste a little bit of space, but in fact it doesn't really waste any space. We needed the circulation anyway, and it makes isolation infinitely easier than taking a studio and putting it right up against an outside window, which you're going to see in about 20 minutes.
Yeah, it helped us in many ways, yeah,
Beautiful
isolation-wise.
foreshadowing, John.
Yeah, and also, we also had the entire heating system for the building below the windows, so if we had to do something, we had to have access panels everywhere. So we decided the corridor was the best bet for everything.
Okay, let's take a look at it.
And after all the pain and suffering,
Just like that. Cue the applause.
yes. These are the finished pictures of the studios. A lot went into every single room, from what you saw before, previous, during the construction, putting all the treatments together, putting all the equipment together. John, what would you say, maybe an 8-month period construction?
That sounds about right.
Yeah,
about
beginning
right.
to end.
A lot longer, didn't it?
Yeah, it felt a little longer, but I think it was just about that timing to get everything wrapped up and finished up. I think actually the rooms, when you see them in plan, they look small, but when you are physically in the rooms, they feel very spacious.
I think we'll wait a little bit to talk. You're going to see different kinds of rooms. Rooms that are self-engineered, rooms that are set up to be engineered from another room, rooms that sort of look like a radio station. Maybe we'll save that dialogue for a little later after we view. John, we throw this sort of AV. You might want to take us through sort of high-level 30,000-foot view of the
Yeah, I mean, this is the signal flow for workflow for one of our edit spaces. So this is one of the simpler rooms. But our general approach, and again, you're going to see some good contrast between the Stitcher space and the Gimlet space. But we're very much XLRs in the walls, future-proofed with Cat 6 Dante ready. But we were sort of adapting what was an existing workflow in our LA mid-roll / earwolf / Stitcher. They've been around for a while, and so the Allen and Heath board, which is not in this edit room, became sort of a staple in LA, and then a staple in our one-room New York studio, and then when we built this, we wanted just to adapt it. So a lot of our workflow is based on an existing workflow, and again, we have a team of engineers who are used to it, so we wanted to make sure that, like the new space, we were coming right in, and we, again, are future-proof, so eventually if we want to get into the more Cat 6 Dante heavy system, we will do that. But our general workflow in the edit and in the main rooms is, and again, this is the edit, so it's a little bit smaller. These rooms are sort of designed more for production, mixing and whatnot, but we also, again, they're ready for, we've done 2-way, 3-way interviews in there, and they're all ready for, phoners, Skypes, IIP, DTL, name whatever IP connection you use these days. We've got it set up in this room. But generally, we are using SM7Bs, going through in the edit suite straight into the Focusrite. I think in this room we got the 18920. In some of our other rooms, the Allen Heath, we go straight in. But we do the cloud lifter with the SM7. That seems to be, again, the acceptable or the standard that was established before. We like the way that mic sounds. Obviously, it's lower gain, so the cloud lifter helps give you that extra juice. And then these rooms are interesting because here...
This might help you this slide.
No, keep going. The Allen Heath, too low.
Yeah, the Allen Heath is this. This is the one of the edit booths. But for us, again, we're doing a lot of... And Judy, we were talking about this just before the panel, but a lot of mix minus. So it's like you're connecting to somebody on Skype, somebody on phone, and everybody needs to get a mix minus. And so the Allen and Heath we really like because it's, again, we have engineers who are basically on every session. So we can hit a mix layer and change something up pretty quickly on the fly. So that was a function that we wanted to make sure stayed in the room and it wasn't sort of put into like a softbox. But yeah, our general workflow is producers in the control room, hosts and interviewees in the live room. And again, that sort of comes from a lot of people in New York have roots at WNYC, other public radio stations where you want the producer, assistant producer, whoever in the control room talking about how the interview's going, deciding what question to ask next. So you have like an active sort of 3 or 4 extra brains who can then talk through a segregated talkback system to the host to say, hey, let's go to question 4 or follow up on the question of childhood or whatever. So a lot of our workflow is based on that sort of separation of producers in the control room, talent in the live room.
John, what percentage are self-produced, where producer, engineer, everybody in the same room?
For us, I would say that maybe 25%. Our producer run where the host or the producer will say, I got this, it's like an interview that I just booked last minute. They're all trained, like we get all of our producers functionally trained on how to set up a Pro Tools session, how to get the Allen and Heath on, how to check, we have all the levels set so it's like not too hot, not too quiet, and we can gain it in post. But I would say 25% are sort of producer run, and then the rest we have an engineer in there. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, let's move from Manhattan to Brooklyn.
Gimlet. Also, Hub, it was a very good location as well for our site. Austin and I became really good friends after the schematic phase. Working on, he's like, well, I'll send you the program, he says, and then I get a long email with all these many rooms we need to put in this space. And I said, okay, we'll try to figure this out for sure.
I think that was your response when we were at 8 rooms, and we ended up with 13. So
the program started with some direction, and then we started to see niches here and there that we could probably sneak in another studio, and And it was very fluid. The design of the studios. Also, we do have viewing windows between some of the podcasts. And similar to Stitcher, Gimlet also has a recording suite. Top left corner, thank you. Recording suite with a live room and a sound log where they also generate content for music. The rest of all the studios are mainly podcasts. Austin and us worked very hard on trying to lay out every single room with the furniture. The furniture on all these rooms are custom, made for each single room, because each room was talking to how many people were going to be in a session. So after we were looking at the sizes of the different rooms and the number of people per room, we were able to lay out each single room with its own custom furniture. It was something that we worked pretty hard on with Austin, and I think it came out pretty good.
Yeah, it came out nice. It's funny, John, you used the phrase, that's 2,000 square feet is what they can spare. It's a funny way to phrase that for core business product, but there was a similar arm wrestling negotiation that went on here. I think the total floor plate for the space we moved into was 28,000 square feet. And I think the podcast studios ended up occupying about between 2,800 and 3,000 of that. So 10% of the floor plate. It looks a little different where it's circled on the plan, but a lot of that is elevator shafts and bathrooms and common areas that come off of that 28,000. So yeah, there was a negotiation process for this is how much we want to grow, this is how much we want to scale, how many shows we want to launch, and let's start the bidding on how much space we can have. And as John alluded to, we discussed early on the idea of having a corridor by those windows, and it was sort of my big push. Having spent a lot of time working in music studios that don't often have a lot of daylight, and sometimes for very good reason. But these studios are occupied for a large majority of the working business hours, and so we really wanted to try to get daylight into those rooms, and that added some isolation issues.
So this is doable, but this is hard. It's hard to do, but it's doable.
Well, one of the things that, talking about the two layouts, and also budgeting and value engineering and all the good stuff that they have now, a project that's being drawn and it's being priced. With Stitcher, for instance, what happened, we did most of the 80% of the construction documents, and the builder started to look at it and came out with a number. And we did a bit of value engineering on the studios. And that's something that John and I everybody worked on to try to see which rooms could potentially be dialed down, if anything, or if we needed to increase the budget that we had. So there was a little bit of conversation after the fact, after doing the drawings, because I don't believe that at the beginning there was a budget set for the studio. On the other hand, when Austin came along, the budget was low for the studios. We always we said that, in the city, if you're making a kind of studio, you won't be able to make it for that money. So what we started to look at in all of the podcasts is how to make it acceptable to the level that they needed to for speech, and not have to incur in a lot of floating floors and acoustic lids and many other things that needed to be accounted for that would start to increase the cost. So that was a little bit different, and we looked at it at the very beginning of the project that steered a little bit how we designed the rooms.
Yeah, for those of you not familiar with the phrase value engineering, it's essentially the process of reckoning with how much it costs to build this, and realizing that you have half as much. So, and one of my favorite quotes from this project was, we asked John, how do we make it cost half as much? And he responded, build half. Not in that space. We spend most of our time out in a section of the open office with a couple small production rooms that WSDG also advised on, where we're doing essentially post-production. There's a lot of pre-production as well in that music planning. But we
So
come
if you
in.
need an engineered session, let's say it's a celebrity of some sort or it's a complex, you're doing it here.
Yeah, exactly.
How's that happened?
Yeah, it happens. We do a lot of rhythm section tracking in that room, music overdubs for things that started in virtual instrument world or were written in the box and then need to be fleshed out. But that room, actually, the dominant resource that provides is space for a lot of our fiction slate. So we're leaning a little harder into that space now, and it just calls for a different type of room. You've got 3 or 4 actors standing in there, riffing off of each other, and they want to be vertical. They want to be standing and have the ability to move, and cool and to some degree flexible as the podcast studios are. They're purpose built, and therefore sitting down and having a discussion. So
It's interesting at the same time, although not shown here, Audible, Amazon company, you might have heard of them, who are not in the podcasting business, but basically their production needs are sort of similar. They basically, people talking in small rooms, self-engineered, also decided to build a music studio for radio drama. Came up with the same conclusion.
yeah. It's good for the business too. I mean, as we discussed with the floor plate, you've got business functions in the building. There are conference rooms. There's all sorts of teams that it takes to run the financial side of the company, and those big studios are great for them. They show clients.
Let's take a look at it being built.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think
man.
Our main challenges, I believe, was, if you can see on the first picture, is the amount of columns and structure in the building, and to put the entire layout to fit within the existing building. That was challenging.
These pictures make me anxious.
Yes. The ceiling height was much better than Stitcher, so I didn't complain.
Well, the ceilings in this area were vaulted, so there was there was some height there, but it was in a very specific place over the tops of the room. So there was a lot of HVAC coordination to get those ducts to land where they were supposed to.
Yeah, you could probably see that on the lower pictures where there's a lot of cables and ducts and everything that runs in the corridor between conduits and HVAC and all the data wiring, etc. It became pretty intense, that corridor. And yes, like Austin said, we had to be below the beams. So although we had that extra space, it wasn't really utilized as much.
You can see we actually couldn't even take advantage of the full height of the windows. We got most of it in there, but adding another layer of glass on the inside of the existing building infrastructure.
Yeah, because when we went and measured, we noticed that these windows weren't providing the isolation we needed. So we actually retrofit the space and put an acoustic wall in front of the existing wall and an acoustic window. That made the space what it is now, the NC15, very quiet space, because it is an avenue, very loud. And this top left is the live room, the recording studio. The control room is to the right. And then we have the long corridor that takes you to the individual podcast studios. And then different configuration of the different podcasts, some with 3 people, some with 4, 6.
It's funny, actually, one of those pictures I think is from the same perspective if you go back a slide.
Almost.
Yeah, so the bottom left.
As you can see, these rooms did have an acoustic lid as well. We were also nervous about the neighbors, not having control of what's happening on the floor above. We had a discussion of renting that space. But then, since we weren't sure if Gimlet was going to rent it or not, we decided to make sure that we were covered in case they didn't get that space and there was another tenant upstairs.
Yeah, the bottom left photo here would be, if you go to the next slide, the bottom photo in the middle.
Yeah.
That's the finished product of that room. Yeah, and just to speak a little bit to the workflow, John was
Let's talk about that.
mentioning some of the differences between the facilities, primarily analog-based setup. There was a lot of deliberation that went on with my team, the engineering team at Gimlet, and also with company leadership there about what approach we were going to take in this facility. And it was driven by that idea of producer-operated sessions. We had 4 studios when we started thinking about this build-out, and we eventually had drawings for 13, and there was always this vague suggestion that we needed to be focusing on this as if 13 might turn into 26 in the near future, and if it does, we want to be able to build them in half the time that it took us to build the first 13. So there was constantly this idea of how do you scale this and how do you sort of commercialize systems that are not terribly complicated. I'm sure Judy is dying to jump in on some of the design. Yeah, but I mean, in comparison to a commercial music recording studio with an analog console and all kinds of outboard gear, these are very simple schematics. So we ended up leaning into audio over IP based workflows, which are, many of you in this room, especially from the public radio side, are very familiar with. And this was stuff that had been around for a long time and was pretty solid. But as we looked through the products that were out there on the market, they were very broadcast focused. That tiny difference between content captured and iterated on and developed for eventual release versus something that's live to air was kind of a really shocking challenge for me. The equipment that was out there catered towards broadcast had certain limitations for that production workflow. This is, I guess, a 4-mic studio. What you'll see is, 6-mic. This is Studio 1.
I think this next one might be better, right? Yeah.
The previous one is good. So 6 mics going into a Focusrite. They're the Neumann BCM 705s, broadcast dynamic mics, going into a Focusrite MP8R. And that MP8R is presenting those inputs as an AES 67 stream onto an audio over IP network. That stream is then picked up by a platform called QSYS, which is made by QSC. And that's doing all of our audio routing in DSP. So all of our mix minuses, John was talking about the importance of mix minuses for all these sources. We've got 2 phone lines per room, a standard 1/8-inch connection that does bidirectional audio. So if you need to plug your phone in, do a FaceTime audio call, plug your laptop in and use Skype, Google Hangouts, you name it, you can get studio quality audio fed into that system, and then you get the return back from it. And then there are various audio codecs, IPDTL, Comrex, et cetera, and all of those require mix minus. So that's all happening in QSYS, and then it's spitting back out a Dante stream that's being picked up by the Pro Tools machine in the room, and then various Dante and AES 67 streams that are picked up by backup recorders and listening stations throughout the facility and all sorts of fun stuff like that.
Austin, when a product is done for that session, either the podcast is not completed or it is completed, how does it leave? Is it sneaker netted, or does it leave to a common server? How do you go get it back when you want to keep working on it?
Yes. So all these studios are recording to a NAS, network storage in the facility, and that is available at every wired workstation in the facility. It's also available over Wi-Fi, so it's very common to see somebody do a 2-hour interview, save on the Pro Tools machine in the studio, walk out to the couch in the lounge, open their laptop, pull that session up, and away they go for editing 2 hours into 30 minutes of interesting content.
Everything is stored.
Yeah, everything is on shared storage, and then that shared storage also has various synchronizations with We have a studio in Minneapolis that was very ad hoc and stood up in a small office space that unfortunately didn't have the budget for a full build out, and another really ad hoc space in San Francisco, all of which are on the pipeline for upgrades in the near future. But those are synchronizing back to the New York office, and then there's Dropbox and all sorts of cloud file sharing that's distributing out to, a producer goes on a recording trip to Kansas City, and they take the session they recorded this morning, save it, it synchronizes to Dropbox, they get on a flight, go to Kansas City, open it, continue on with their work.
I don't know if the slide is worth discussing.
Let's see, what is this? So yeah, this is just working through some of the connections in the rack that's in each studio. So the microphone preamp is local in the room. There's a battery backup, and there is a DAA to take AES 67, translate to analog back out for our headphone mixes.
They're essentially identical electronically.
Yeah, all of the podcast studios have the exact same slate of equipment, the only difference being the number of microphones in
And
them.
how long does it take one of your producers who's not terribly technical to get to be able to use it?
So I don't do any training sessions any longer. Teams are responsible as they onboard new, if it's an intern, associate producer, new producer, the teams will talk those new hires through how to use the studios. And on average, I would say you probably you're lucky if you get 15 minutes in a room before you're off and running on your first interview. So yeah, it's very, very little time to get familiar with the equipment. It's designed to be very intuitive. High turnover. These studios are booked for 30 minutes to 2 hours, back to back, all day long, and there's never any buffer time between those sessions. So you're running in as soon as someone left, and launching into an interview. So it's all based around an iPad interface. When we went from 8 studios to 13 studios, it became very clear we were not going to have countertop space for physical mixers, nor did we really have a need for them because none of this stuff is going live to air. So it's all built around an iPad interface, and the producers in the room have to interact with the computer where they'll open their Pro Tools template, and an iPad where they will turn on number of mics they're going to use, dial out any phone lines, make any remote connections.
Well, before we leave, I
Just want to make a note about the file sharing and how podcasts are created, because they don't start in one room and finish in the same room in one day. As we were talking about how they were creating the podcast, it could be a whole week worth of work, working in different rooms. So one of the things that was very important was to keep the same reverberation time in all the rooms, although the volumes were different, to be equal, so that one could be recording part of a podcast in Studio 1, and another one could be recording the podcast in Studio 3, and still when they would mesh it together would be fine, and you wouldn't find the difference that it was mixed in a different room. So that was also very important as we were polishing.
that was a point I was going to thank you. This actually sounds easy, but it turns out to not be as easy as we even thought. And we've done a lot of rooms. There's a huge misnomer. Small rooms are easy. Actually, small rooms are much harder to design than big rooms. Much harder. Low frequency issues are infinitely harder in small rooms than big rooms. Of course, we have a slight advantage here in that we don't have a lot of low frequency content, but there is low frequency information in the spoken male voice. And Austin was pretty insistent on it, and 13 rooms to get them to sound identical. And as Romy said, it's not only reverb time, it's first order reflections. And we didn't even realize this. It's very important that they're identical. And I'd never actually experienced this firsthand. One of Austin's first tests, I believe, was to run a session in every room, right? We just kept duplicating the same session to see if it sounded the same.
Yeah,
That was the first test.
I took a script and recorded sentence by sentence in a bunch of different studios, and then cut it together as if I had
We
done
ended
it.
up modifying 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
The cloud got changed, a little tiny reflection wasn't exactly the same. But this is not an experience that we would have in a large, quote, I don't like to use the word world-class studio, where you have a live room that basically we have target reverb times, and it ends up getting a signature. And of course, since it's a big room, producers can change microphones and bilbos and sort of get it to work, to do whatever they want. And then we have 2 ISO booths, and to tell you the truth, you almost want them not to sound the same. As a matter of fact, you do want them to not sound the same. You want them to have kind of a signature of each one of those, and those guys can have their own sort of style and flavor to them. Not the case here. We can have a flavor, but they better all be exactly the same flavor. Very strange requirement.
Do you remember what RT60 targets were for the Gimlet rooms?
1.2, very low.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because even that in itself is a decision.
That's a
You know,
decision.
if you're looking at, is this a show where my host sounds like the voice in my head? Or is this a show where the nature of it is a discussion in a room, and I want to be able to sense two people in a room having a conversation? You know, we kind of try to.
These rooms are not that dry. These rooms in the ISO booth, vocal booth world are not that dry, and they were in fact a little wetter, I'll just use that term, than the 4 rooms you were used to, and it took a little getting used to them. But then I think everybody's become quite comfortable with it.
Yeah, a little fine tuning and a little bit of acclimating to it. And,
Yeah.
it's been great.
But that was a very interesting requirement that we had never directly experienced. And it's because a typical podcast is usually not done in the same room, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's very common for an episode of one of our shows to have been assembled from 4, 5, 6 interviews that were done in different studios, host tracking that was done a week ago, today, across periods of time. So that's very common, and it's also not, in rooms where you're dealing with even a vocal booth where it's a solo vocalist. There's often a lot of additional processing on that, right?
Yeah.
It's not music. You're not. When you listen to our shows, there are moments where something that a host recorded a week ago, halfway through that sentence, it cuts to something he said today, and there's enough challenges in tone of voice and matching that stuff, let alone the room that you're in. So you hear all of those changes, those cuts, and the room tone behind it is.
We also don't have the advantage, we have no ability to change the location of anything in the room. Even in relatively small ISO booths, you can move a mic, you can move a vocalist, no, these are locked, fixed positions, so it was interesting. All right, so I would like Judy, stand up here if you want. That'll be easier, then you can yell and scream at technical guys. Okay.
My session on Saturday got me sick, so I apologize. 16 hours in a room, and this is what I get.
I'm going to leave this up just to remind us where we are, but
So, I do a number of things. System design, in the context of working with an architectural firm, is a little different than being, in the old days, the chief engineer of the facility would do the design of the system. But I do part of that, that's part of it, figure out how the whole thing's going to wire together to make happen the system that people want to have happen, but also delve into the power that's going on in the facility and all the conduit routing and how that is all going to work. And then, of course, we start with one concept of conduit routing and hit VE, and then we have to go someplace else, which can be impacted by the construction. So when I do my job, the first thing I have to do is find out how people are working, and obviously we have 2 different workflows here. And then what infrastructure is going to suit what they're doing now and what they're going to do in the future, so future-proof that. And there's a negotiation to keep it as inexpensive as possible, because as you can see, these are both in the budget realm, so people don't have heart failure while actually making it constructible and not ruin the isolation. So there's that negotiation throughout the process. Then another fun new challenge of the wonderful world of podcasting. In a recording studio where the vocalist walks in with their cell phone on, and I start hearing it in my mic line, I tell them to turn the damn thing off and put it away. You can't do that in a podcast studio. It does not work. And we are having a wonderful world of wireless everywhere, so more and more things are being impacted by that. So at Stitcher, they had...
So we're going to talk about a mistake or a glitch.
I'm not even sure I would call it a mistake or a glitch. Well,
It's a glitch.
there was...
Which of these drawings help you? This one?
Probably none of them. I'm going to basically walk through. So, as Wilson's described, he's got an audio over IP workflow, so this is great. Everything's leaving the studio after some mic pre, whatever, it's Dante the rest of the way, Dante/AES 67 until it comes back into the studio. So he's not really dealing with analog lines for his cue, except at the point that they hit the headphone box, and he's about to change that. Okay? So, on the other hand, in Stitcher, we're very much still in the analog domain. So this means we have live mics on a table and we have cell phones on a
That
table.
decision was a legacy decision, basically.
Yeah, legacy decision, and also it's sort of the speed with which our company is sort of staffing up is different than Gimlet's. We didn't hire sort of our lead systems engineer, the sort of tech genius brain of Austin's caliber, until
Massively overstated.
probably not, but we didn't hire that position until halfway, 2/3 of the way through our design. So for me, I'm like, you know, again, we're taking an existing process, a legacy process, and I'm working with Judy to design the system. So it is an analog system, but with the sort of future-proofing that we can move in this direction.
Right, and that of course is one of the things that drives any system design is how does the client want to work? I'm not going to tell them what to do. I want to hear how they want to work, and then I want to figure out the best way to suit what they have to do. These guys had to move from a one-room studio where they're producing everything and immediately go into a new facility while producing their podcast. And to the extent that we even had to stage the move of equipment in to keep the studio running they had. So it made no sense at all to change the system they were operating on because it worked for them. But where we ran into a problem was they had a desire to have an intercom system from the control. So they have a control with the producer, and they want to have a cue system back to the talent. They want to have one button for the host and one button for the guests. Okay, so the producer can talk to either the host or the guests as they chose. We did kind of a system that was fine. It was analog. But the problem we ran into was we used a system that had self-powered cue boxes. Okay, mounted under the table. Put down a cell phone. What do you get? Whoops. So we're actually, so we had to play fun and games to figure that out. And we're going back to an actual more traditional system where I'm going to have the amplifier in the control room, running out the headphones out there because the amplified signal doesn't care. But that's the kind of thing that you can run into that you don't expect in these facilities. In general,
You would
cell
have never
phones...
seen that in a recording studio. You would have
No.
told someone to turn their cell phone off.
Yeah. At this point, and that's something everybody working on designing a facility has to really be aware of because we still have analog audio in some portion of the facility, and yet we have more and more wireless devices surrounding us. And so being careful about things like where are people placing WAPs, can I keep them away from areas where we're going to have very low level audio? You have to pay attention to a lot of the things that are surrounding the facility when you build it because you're going to have audio problems when you're still in the analog domain, and we will be in the analog domain for a while. I mean, so that was the big lesson from Stitcher and...
But less analog in Gimlet, right?
Less, yeah, but still issues with that, and you're right. You can't ask somebody to take the computer out of the room when the computer is the remote source that they're talking to. So.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell them to actually take the power supply out of the wall and run it on battery, but that's about as far as you can get. So, I mean, those were the big takeaways for me.
How are you going to solve this problem? How are we going to solve it?
We have solved the problem. Somebody has to implement the solving, but we know what the solution is. It's in process. Anything you guys want to talk about in the art interface on creating systems or lessons you took away from the whole experience of creating? Because essentially I was your chief engineer till you got one. Austin was a chief engineer, but that's one of my jobs as chief engineer for hire until they actually get somebody. So what do you take away from that job?
I mean, the coming from I am traditionally an engineer. I'm in the room, I'm recording the things, I'm taking the material in Pro Tools, I'm mixing. That's sort of that's where my bread and butter is. So this was a new challenge for me. And so the one thing I found in this, I mean, again, in saying, here's what we want the room to work like. And then we'd hand the ball off, and they'd come back with these schematics and these workflows. I was more into signal flow schematics than I've ever been in my life. I think the intricacy and sort of the forethought that needs to go into the system, that was my takeaway. And I sort of think if I could go back, I know this is something maybe we'll talk about later, but if I could go back and do it again, I would want to get versed up on that sort of what the forethought is and look at the signal flow a lot sooner, maybe even before the room design. But my takeaway was simply that you literally have so many components going here and there that in the grand scheme of all your use cases, there are always 4 or 5 use cases that you just don't think of in the design. And so that's the thing is system design happens, but it doesn't stop. It's an ongoing process. So we're still ironing out things and making sure that we get the best audio that we can get.
Did you get enough extra tie lines and other things in your facility to make it work? Because that's one of the things that's really important is to build for the future, because you don't know what the future's
Yeah,
going to be.
future-proof was a term that we threw. Every conversation that I had with Judy and Romina was, how can we future-proof this room if we want to move to a new system, or if we want this room to have triple, quadruple function? Like, imagine like those super rare use cases, and then try and make that room fit the bill.
My question to both of you, do you feel your facilities are relatively future-proofed technically?
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I can't think of
Austin's is already in the future. When I visited, it's really beautiful, the interfaces and things like that. And I know I talked to them, they had like a chance to like really test things and build a system and talk about that, you know. And ours is more like, we are on the run, we've got a system that works, we've got to go with it. But everything in our system is designed that if we want to move towards acoustics or something that's very Dante and less analog, like we are wired for it, which is great. So like our space is very flexible, and we've always got those lovely 3 pins in the wall if you need to fall back.
We actually had the opposite conversation in the design phase when I was pitching this acoustics system, and the company said, "Great, our analog studios worked really well. Why aren't we doing that? Telesax is in 8,000 facilities all over the world. Why aren't we doing that? Are you designing something? What happens 2 weeks into this facility when your plan fails?" And so we actually ended up adding very late in the game analog wiring, a couple channels from every studio, and making sure that we had enough connections that if something terrible happened in my plans, we could buy a bunch of minus M32s, which is what we were using prior, and put them in the rooms and have all the wiring in place to be able to sort of step back and reevaluate.
Yeah, but see, Austin had luxury, he had time. John had no time, and that was the big difference you had here. John literally had to, what did you, we moved the studio in the middle. One studio went up in the new facility, the old studio went down, got moved, so they just kept on
It
going.
was literally like a down to the last minute where our 8th Avenue studio, which by the way was a lesson in like great walls, but there was concrete floor and there was somebody above it, whether it was high heels or combat boots, like go to get their coffee, go to the bathroom, and we would literally have to stop interviews and wait for them and listen to them, and you could hear them sit down. But we were hitting max capacity in that room, and we had to actually change the install to get one done by November 1, or I tried to come up with some saying that like rhymed that would motivate people. But they got our Studio C up and running and sort of redid the install schedule so that we could get into that room and not have to hire additional studios other places. They got that room done, we moved in there, and then they got the second room done just in time for us to move in. So it was really good.
And with Austin, the conversation where he's saying like analog, I had that very same conversation where I said, are you absolutely sure that your producers are going to buy into this? Because he has half traditional producers and half new people. And he's like, I believe they will, but we will build a system. And you have how many months? 2 months ahead of time you would build a system for people to test and try?
Yeah, so
But they actually bought in, and so that's what time helps.
We spent a year, to your point about time, we spent a year developing the system, but there was a significant amount of time where we stood up a fully operational prototype in one of our studios in our previous location and honed it from there.
I want to throw out 1 or 2 questions, and hopefully that'll prompt some people in the audience to ask a question. So, as I said in the beginning podcasting, you can't really open a paper or a journal and not see somebody talking about podcasting. There's thousands of them. I was in Australia not that long ago and got a tour of the Road factory. That owner is a good friend, and got to see that $800 podcaster, basically a podcasting studio in a box, a little bit before it hit the market. It's extraordinary. You add that and a microphone and a few baffles, and you're in the podcasting business in your living room or your bedroom. And I've actually been on the end of one of those podcasts. I've been in Daytown talking for 45 minutes. We've just explored 2 facilities that are anything but that. Without stating the obvious, why can't somebody do this? Why didn't you do this 13 times? Why didn't you get 13 broadcasters?
So these designs are meant to support 13 studios that are on, theoretically 24 hours a day. The facilities open and people can work in them. And we need the ability to make sure that they work reliably and can go through troubleshooting remotely and all sorts of challenges that a home user might not have.
One quick question, and then the doozy, and then I'm going to turn it over. We'll go for lunch. What is the usage? About how many hours a day is your studios are you being used, and what percentage? What's the capacity that's going on over there right now?
That's a great question. I would say there is.
Could I walk in and see all of them being used sometimes?
Yes, middle of the day on a weekday for sure. You might also go for lunch and come back 30 minutes later and they're all empty. So it's very dynamic in our facility. It depends on when your interviewees are available and do those, convolute and pile up on top of each other. But
used in the evening?
Yeah, I mean, your best shot at having whatever studio you want is between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. Our facility is pretty quiet in the morning, so if you're early to rise, you got all the time you need. But from 10 to I would say usually 8 to 9 in the evening, and then on published days for some shows 2, 3 in the morning.
It's full. And John?
Yeah, it's similar. I mean, we have room on our calendar, but again, we have the same thing where it's like the bunch ups. Everybody wants time between 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So you might walk in, and all 3 of our studios and our 2 edit booths are being used. And then, like I said, you'll come back from lunch and they're all available. So it really depends on what kind of session you're doing. But our capacity, I would say, if you went on raw hours, not peak hours, like we're probably at like 50%. But we're scaling. And every month it gets busier. And again, sometimes we have a show that it's a serialized show that is going to be in the same studio, 3 times a week for 4 hours for 3 months, and then they're done. So it's a little bit of bitch and purge sometimes.
I'd say 50% is accurate for us.
Yeah. So my final tee up, you know it's coming, is if you had one thing to do over again, what would it be in this process?
You asked me this.
We were
No.
talking about this before, yeah.
Chris asked me this. I don't remember what my response was.
One thing. What would you? If you had one thing that either in the planning, staging, new site was wrong. I don't know. Just choose one.
Hire a different building.
Hire a different.
I'll buy that one. I'll buy that one. Yeah, a builder who's experienced in these types of facilities. We had a ton of issues.
Just choose one. No.
Just choose one. You can pick one.
Oh, you get one. So you do this.
I'll take it away.
I mean, if I could do it over, the one thing that I would want more time. I mean, I would want to hire Austin to design. But I would actually want to borrow some of the sort of future-leaning elements. We again, the way that our timeline for getting it was very, very, very.
It was not good.
We had to stick a landing, and we did it. And the one thing I would say is that like the rooms sound amazing, and the equipment that we have in there all sounds amazing. There's a few things to iron out. But I think that like if I could go back, I would try and ask for like 6 months of time just to sort of road test and develop some things. And it's not that like anything in our studio doesn't work or that I would change it. Or it's all sounding great. It's just a matter of like building things that sort of lean in the direction of Austin is saying, making them more self-guiding, so that our lead systems engineer isn't going in to like restart the computer or to do this or to pay attention to the buzz in this line. You know what I mean? It's like getting them more towards the point that they are sort of self-guiding systems.
So you can't have too much height, and you can't have too much time.
I would go back to the program, and I think that's you were very adamant about that early in the process, and I underestimated the value there. I think I would spend more time. I would take the drawing that you saw, and I would spend more time talking with production teams about how they work, how many people are in the room, where they want to sit when you're a host and you're a producer, and what's the dynamic? Do you want to be across from each other or next to each other? And probably what would have manifested from that is slightly different table arrangements, different shapes, and we would have we probably would have built the same number of rooms, but we would have utilized them a little differently.
It's I've asked this question for 50 years in one way or another. It is the single most common mistake. It's underestimating programming. Some people don't even understand what the word means. It seems boring. Let's just jump right in. I know what I want. But more mistakes are made because you just haven't spent enough time on program. Those are two really good answers. We got a little time to go out there.
Okay,
Good
first
morning,
off,
sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you again.
And I want to thank you for over 2 decades of being the opening act.
I had to even do your job this morning.
I apologize, but unfortunately I was pulled in another direction. But my question to you, to both of you, how much thought has been given to adding video into the complex? Because I mean, I know in our podcast where I work, everyone's worrying more about the camera than the microphone. I keep telling them that the microphones are important too. So I noticed you have very small spaces. Did you think of video? Are there places for cameras? Is there a lighting grid and so forth?
I know that it was a consideration when we were building, and Studio A is sort of our larger space, that we thought, oh, if anybody wants to use video, that will be the room we'll do it. But we've actually had a number of shows in Studio B and C, our sort of regular roundtable rooms, and they do video in there. And I can't tell you exactly what the video system is. Our lead systems engineer has pulled it together, but it's in the modern technology. It's small, it's compact. We set it up, we break it down in an hour.
They're bringing in some lighting, but they're just using the room lighting.
Just using the room lighting. We have done a couple sort of special interviews where somebody will bring in some lighting. But it's on our radar as something to add. It was one of those sort of fascinating things for me where it was like, okay, everyone's like pivoting to podcasts, and now podcasts are pivoting to video. Isn't that TV? But it's not, because it's YouTube, it's streaming. And so I always say like podcasts are not media, they're social media. And so I think like viewing the video aspect of that social media as part of our product is something that, again, it's not, we may be in my time there in 4 years, I think there's been like 3 shows that have had a consistent demand to have video. So it's not like a huge demand for our shows yet.
So you don't see a video control room being added, or
Not a video control room.
robotic cameras or so forth?
I don't think so.
John,
I can't say.
I want to thank you.
We got another person who wants to answer.
Oh, okay.
Sure. I mean, we talked about this a lot in the design phase, and the advantage for us was clear direction from leadership. So, I mean, we looked at the slate for 2 and 3 years ahead and said, we're trying to make 25, 30, 50, God, we don't know how many shows. Let's focus on the audio piece of this and just either run the wiring if we can afford it, or give us the spare conduit so that we can pull this stuff in later. And we're seeing a lot more consideration for video in designs that we're working on together for Spotify right now. Studios that will likely have cameras in their initial design. I think it's becoming more important especially for marketing and promotional content. So,
Great.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. Very interesting about the problem of the cell phones, and the contribution is.
It's an interesting word. Interesting.
Yeah.
It hasn't been that interesting.
When you design equipment, there are standards that any equipment that's designed is tested for RF interference. So why is this such a problem? So I think it's underappreciated that the levels, when you go to have your equipment tested for like CE, RF, immunity, the level that's coming out of your cell phone up close can be up to 100 times what those test levels are. So that's the fundamental problem, is that the test levels are not high enough.
Well, in this case, literally the wiring is all under the table, so
Yeah,
if things are happening, they put the cell phone down right on top of it, so you're about this far away. Plus, the audio turned out to be single-ended from the self-powered cue boxes, so basically it hits a slate and then it goes single-ended from the amplifier out, so it was a nightmare.
So the takeaway is realizing that we've had this change in the RF levels that we're actually experiencing from things like setting a cell phone down on top of something is way beyond what the test limits were ever set for. So something has to change. And I don't think the cell phones are going away.
No, I think you just have to be super aware of that when you're doing a system design and even balance will not necessarily save you if you're dealing with low enough level. That's why it's getting induced into microphones. So, we'll have to pay attention and also consider the application.
I want to thank everybody for coming today. John, thank you again for 2 decades of being the opening act, even though you scream at me every time I put you first. Coming up in this room after opening ceremonies, we have innovations in audio
I
processing.
already did this. You weren't here, but we did this.
Yeah, but you know what? Let me remind you.
Okay.
Advanced audio for sports, and tonight over at the Radio Waves building, we're going to have an intimate evening with Tesla and Twain. Tickets are available at the tours desk or registration desk. You can get them. And tomorrow we're going to, and Thursday and Friday, all the broadcast sessions will be in this room as well. Please go to aesbroadcast.com. And if you have any comments, suggestions, please email broadcast@aes.org. And if you have any complaints, send them to John.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I want to, personal thanks to Okay.
Howard reminded me, tomorrow afternoon we're having a tour of Stitcher, but you must get a ticket because it is limited. And that is at the registration desk as well. And I highly recommend it.
That'll be fun. It's not that far from here.
And thank you again. And also I want to thank Howard Sherman for being the mediator and organizer of this hidden.
Thanks, John, Austin, Romy, Judy. Thanks.